Good afternoon and welcome to the Women in Science Entrepreneurship Fund Speaker Series and our program today, Pathways in Bioscience, 4 Perspectives Beyond the Bench. My name is Karen Akinsanya and I am Executive Vice President, Chief Biomedical Scientist and Head of Research and Development at Schrödinger. I'm delighted to be here also as a trustee of Rockefeller University. It is a pleasure to have you with us in our virtual audience, and I look forward to hosting this conversation. Our 3 panelists will join us momentarily. I would first like to tell you a bit about the Women in Science Entrepreneurship Fund, or the WEF as it's called for short. The WEF was launched last year by generous supporters of women and science who want to provide guidance and resources to Rockefeller University scientists, particularly women who wish to pursue translational research. Rockefeller has a strong commitment to encouraging equal participation in entrepreneurial opportunities. The goal of WEF is to ensure that women scientists are taking advantage of these opportunities by providing the tools, including training, mentorship, and financial support to help them consider the possible applications of their lab discoveries for development as medical therapeutics or other treatments. One key aspect of the WEF is a competitive grants program to fund projects led by Rockefeller women scientists. The WEF grants program was established last fall and is administered alongside Rockefeller's Robertson Therapeutic Development Fund. In the first 2 rounds of funding, a total of 7 WEF grants have been awarded, 3 WEF pilot grants in the fall and 4 in the spring. The awardees and their projects are shown on your screen. Congratulations to all. Rockefeller Laboratories have been invited to submit proposals for the next round of proof of concept grants from both the WEF and the Robertson Therapeutic Development Fund. The deadline is later this month. If you are eligible, I hope you will consider applying for this translational funding. Another important feature of the WEF is the speaker series. Today, in the 3rd webinar in this series of talks with women leaders in pharma and biotech. The purpose of these conversations is for you in our audience, many of whom are early career scientists, to hear directly from these experts and ask the questions you have about what is possible for your own careers. I was delighted to be the first speaker in this series last December in a conversation hosted by Elaine Fuchs. This past spring, Dr. Brady Hauser gave a presentation on the translational development ecosystem and how to navigate its complexities. The videos from these first 2 webinars can be found on the WEF website. We will share that link at the end of this program. Before we begin our discussion, I encourage you to send us your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will get to as many of your questions as possible in the next hour. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome our panelists this afternoon. Each of these 3 speakers began their careers in bench science and then each took a different path within the translational ecosystem. The commonality they have is a connection to Rockefeller and a desire to help other researchers get the most out of their careers. I will give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves. Some of you in our audience have asked that our panelists share their journey, starting from receiving their PhDs to their current roles. So let's start there. Let's hear first from Jessica Hopfield. Jessica is a 1991 graduate of Rockefeller University who went on to get an MBA from Harvard. She has more than 25 years of experience in both pharma and biotech at the executive level, including a lengthy tenure at McKinsey & Company. Now, Jessica is a consultant who also serves on the board of several companies, including Insulet Corporation, Editas Medicine, and Maravai. She also was the chair of the Joslin Diabetes Center. Jessica, thank you for joining us. Please tell us more about your career.
Thank you, Karen. I'm delighted to be here Zooming with all of you. I'm a protein biochemist by training. I worked jointly between the labs of Torsten Wiesel and Paul Greengard, looking for the functional effects of various proteins that are enriched in brain. It was an extraordinary opportunity, which I look back on with a great fondness, to work with two Nobel laureates at that level of science and their extraordinary intellects and characters. After I got my PhD, I stayed on for a while as a postdoc, and it was clear to me at that point that I wanted to do something more applied or translational with my science. I used to write papers, and to get them into a fancy journal, the last line would have a phrase like, "This could have some utility in curing Parkinson." And that, in fact, maybe it was true, but it was going to be decades, and I was itching to do something that had impact on a shorter time scale. And at the time, and this was late 80s, early 90s, biotech was just starting up, with the ascendancy of molecular biology and the discovery of monoclonal antibodies. And so I was interested in really moving over to that burgeoning industry and doing something that mattered there. I also had a little bit of insight that I needed help. I'm a third generation PhD. My father's a theoretical physicist. Both of his parents were physicists. And I grew up in an insular academic bubble of science, which was marvelous, but it's not the complete world. And so I thought I better get some more training, and where better to do that than Harvard Business School, which I viewed as a crash course in capitalism, and I say that fondly. Ever since then, I've always done things that are on the interface of important science and the business world, and trying to move things from the bench to actually impacting people in an immediate way. I actually have two sets of business cards, one that lists my PhD and one that doesn't, depending on which side of the fence I'm on that day. And after my MBA, I went to work at Merck for a few years in their clinical development group, which was great training in the kinds of things that Leigh and Jeanne will talk about. How do you move a drug from an animal model into patients? How do you run a trial? How do you work with the FDA? How do you launch? I then was at McKinsey as a partner for many years, helping biotech and pharmaceutical companies do what they do best. And most recently, I've been sitting on boards, and I'm going to spend a second on that because it just gives you a sense of the kinds of things that you can do over time. Insulet is a medical device board. It makes diabetic patch pumps for type 1 and type 2 patients. These are pumps that are connected to a cell phone and have very complicated algorithms and AI to slowly drip insulin into the patient during the day. So it's taught me a lot about software engineering and the interface between AI and devices. I also sit on the board of Maravai. Maravai makes the capping technology that protects the mRNA as it's made into the COVID vaccine. So I'm very proud to say that our technology is now in 2.7 billion arms, including many of yours. So it has been marvelous during the pandemic to do more than simply Zoom all day and feel like I've had at least a small role in helping the vaccines be successful. And I also sit on the board of Editas, and Editas is one of the CRISPR gene editing companies that Jennifer Doudna and colleagues formed. And we are just moving into the clinic now, both for a hereditary form of blindness and for sickle cell. And we're hoping that we will be able to cure both those diseases with a single treatment. So exciting times. So that's what I'm up to. My path from Rockefeller to here has not always been linear, and it has not always been easy. And I'm happy to share with you what I can to help all of you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jessica. Now I'd like to welcome Jeanne Farrell, who is the Associate Vice President of Technology Transfer here at Rockefeller. This is a very important role, and I look forward to talking with you more about tech transfer. Jeanne received her PhD in pharmacology at Weill Cornell. Before coming to Rockefeller in 2018, Jeanne worked at Mount Sinai Health System, where she served as Managing Director of Business Development. Jeanne, can you tell us about your journey in science?
Sure. Thank you, Karen, and thank you for this opportunity. So I would say that my journey in science also took, I would say, a non-linear path, and starts a little bit before figuring out what to do after my PhD. I had gotten an undergraduate degree from Fordham University and ended up staying there. I thought I was going to earn my doctoral degree from Fordham. After working in a laboratory there and really being interested in the molecular biology side of research, I thought that it would be a better move for me to carry on my degree at Weill Cornell Medicine, so a little bit closer to what I thought my ambitions were, which were in the field of molecular biology and pharmacology. And so I got my my master's degree at Fordham, and then came over to Weill Cornell Medicine. I got my degree in the laboratory of Lonnie Levin and Jochen Buck, so just across the street. And nearing the end of my time there, there was a discovery that was made in the laboratory. And very serendipitously, I met somebody in the Cornell Technology Transfer Office, hit it off, and I ended up as an intern, I think maybe the first intern there, and was doing that as I was finishing up my thesis work. From there, I started at an entry-level position in the tech transfer office at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and that was really soup to nuts and where I did much of my training. I was there for about 5 years before being recruited over to Mount Sinai Health System. I spent another 5 years there before coming here at Rockefeller. And I will say technology transfer, and I think that's the name of our office, that's generally the name of our field, but it captures only one small portion of what we do, and I think we can talk about this more later. But largely my role in science here is to facilitate the ability to move research that's done at a bench to a place where it can get closer to reaching patients. It's very much aligned with Rockefeller's mission of science for the benefit of humanity. And so academics and academic universities are not capable of, let's say, putting a product on the market themselves. And so it necessarily means that we do need to find a partner, whether it's a biotech company, a pharma company, or some other commercial entity, to take a product, a dream of a product, and turn it into something that actually can make it to market. And so my role here as a scientist is also as a seller of dreams, because we take things that are little inklings, little discoveries, sometimes they're a little bit bigger than that, and help envision what it can truly be, and then find somebody else who believes in that dream and will take it all the way to fruition.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeannie. And now let's welcome Leigh Baxt. Leigh received her Ph.D. in microbiology and immunology from Stanford and is now an associate director of biology at the Tri-Institutional Therapeutics Discovery Institute, or TRYDI, TRIDI for short. The partnership includes Rockefeller, Weill Cornell Medicine, and Memorial Sloan Kettering, along with biopharmaceutical partner Takeda. The Therapeutics Discovery Institute work with academic scientists in this community on the translation of basic research into drug discovery projects. Leigh, please tell us more about your career path.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to the WEF committee for having me here today. I'm really honored and privileged to join this group of amazing women. I'm a little earlier in my career than both of these very accomplished women here, so it's a little shorter, but I also had a pretty non-linear career path. I would say that I didn't have the mentorship and the resources that are available to everyone today. So I had a few stumbling blocks along my way, and I hope those can be lessons to other people in how to be a little bit more strategic in your decisions as you pursue a career outside of academia. So as many of you may know, my husband is the head of lab here at Rockefeller. My mom was a PI at the University of Pennsylvania. My dad was a physician, also an academic. Literally everyone in our family is in science and medicine in academia. So I didn't have any examples of what a non-academic career looked like, and really grew up thinking that was sort of what you do if you're a scientist, is academia. By the time I started grad school at Stanford, everyone just said, do what you're interested in. So I joined a parasitology lab, which is pretty specific. And I worked on intramembrane proteases in entamoeba. That's a pretty big niche. It kind of backs you into corner a little bit. So I learned a lot of really useful skills because I worked on things no one in my lab knew how to do. So I really had to learn everything myself, from looking at materials and methods in a paper and talking to people, which was on its own a very good skill. When I finished grad school, I knew that I didn't want to start my own research lab, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I loved microbiology, and I was always interested in bacterial pathogenesis. So I went to do a postdoc in host pathogen interaction at Harvard with Marsha Goldberg. And in that lab, I got a lot more cell biology. So a lot more sort of more useful real world technical ability. But even there, I knew that, I didn't want to do this. I wanted to do something a little bit more translational. But unfortunately, my lab was a very small lab that no one had ever gone to industry from. So I didn't have those connections. And despite living in Boston, if you're in the biotechnology industry there, the joke is that even the barista at Starbucks has a PhD from Harvard. So having the good degrees didn't really set you apart. So I did a lot of efforts to network through LinkedIn and career panels and Mass Bio, which is like a biology group in Massachusetts, and did everything I could. And I ended up getting recruited by a headhunter for a very, very small startup where they were going to take parasite eggs to treat IBD by having Th2 skewing in the gut. These are eggs that were actually for a pig worm, so they shouldn't cause any pathology in a human. It was a really interesting idea. With my background of enteric pathogens and my sort of, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed feeling coming out of a postdoc, it was a good fit for me. But unfortunately, I took the job. I left my postdoc in my last 4 years of fellowship, or 4 months of fellowship funding. And on my very first day, 30 minutes after I arrived, our CEO announced that he was going to take 90% of our funds to invest in other ventures, and we wouldn't actually be starting the lab that I was hired to build out. So that was a pretty tough lesson. I learned that you need to look a little deeper into companies that you're interested in and where their financing comes from and what their pipeline looks like. But it was a really big lesson for me. They kept me on for about 3 or 4 months and taught me a little bit of this and that. And then I was kind of on my own again. And luckily, through all the networking I had done, I found out about a position at the Broad that was studying something that I had a lot of experience with. And this was a lab with essentially unlimited funding who could do anything you wanted. So I said, I know how to do this, and you have all these techniques that are translational. So let me come and do these projects for you and learn things that are a little bit more relevant to industry. So I was at the Broad for about 4 years. At that point, my husband went on the job market and had, applied to like 35 places, and then got second interviews at many of those. So we sort of narrowed down where to go on our second interviews by what options I would have. And as chance would have it, Rockefeller set up meetings for me when we were recruited here, including a meeting with Mike Foley, who's the former CEO of TDI. And it wasn't a job interview, but when I came in, I did have a resume with me. And he said, you should just come work here. And I didn't know it was even an option. And I was, in retrospect, so fortunate that he took that chance on me, because I didn't know what this job would be when I started, but it's actually an amazing fit for my skill set. And it's a really great place. And I couldn't imagine being elsewhere. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So many of the graduate students and postdocs in our audience may be considering jobs outside of academia in fields like biotech and pharma and other industries, some of which you've already touched on. What guidance would you give to young scientists who are considering these options? And what are the pros and cons of taking that leap? Maybe we can start with Jeanne.
Sure. So I think in terms of finding opportunities here in New York City, I'd say particularly over the past decade, there really has been a concerted effort to grow the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so there are many opportunities to attend lectures, seminars, informative series about alternative careers, whether that ranges from being part of a startup or a biotech company to being a patent attorney, or really, frankly, something else, anything else. I think something that is particularly unique to people who spend time earning their doctoral degree in a hard science is that what is really valuable is that we learn a way to critically think. And that can be applied across almost any sector and is what sets people apart. And so I would say avail yourself of all of the opportunities around New York City, and also just talk to people like Jessica, like Leigh, like myself, Karen, like you, who are doing something different than traditional academic bench science. I can tell you that certainly when I was getting my PhD, I was not fully aware of all of the opportunities that were out there. And I really only started to scramble to figure it out the last year when I was pretty sure that I wanted to step away from the bench. But I didn't know that much at that time. In terms of the pros and cons, I would say, I'm not sure if it's a pro or con, but really just a word of warning is, when you decide, or if you decide that you don't want to do, I guess, what is considered a traditional career, a traditional trajectory, which is the postdoc, tenure track, laboratory position, et cetera, is still be smart about what you want to do. Don't just take a job because it's not the job you don't want to do, but that you seek out something you do want to do and really go after that. So I don't know, again, if that really fits into a pro or a con, but it really is a word of warning, because I think if you take a job running away from one thing and not running towards something, you'll find yourself just simply in a different career that you don't want to do. And so I think be measured and strategic about the field and the position that you may want to take when you have made the decision to take the leap.
Great, thank you. Jessica, you've seen the role of women in leadership positions expand over the last 25 years in your industry. What still needs to be done to expand opportunities for women in senior positions across the board in academia and in business? Do you think this is an exciting time for women, and if so, why?
I think it's actually an extraordinary time for women, and it is very different than when 25, 30 years ago, when I was both doing bench science and made the move. At this point, there are women throughout biotech and pharmaceuticals and medical publishing, you name it, investment banks, consulting at the highest levels. And the reason is sort of simple, which is if you're going to be in this sector of the economy, people are going to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions, into these companies to try and bring drugs to market. All they care about is competence, right? And women bring, I think, an extraordinary blend of IQ and EQ. And let's face it, the academic research is true. We do have better EQ. We do work better in teams. And in fact, there's now research that shows that if there are 3 or more women on a corporate board, the board has stronger performance than boards that are primarily driven by men. So that says something about our ability to drive performance. So now across biotech, women CEOs are quite common. The boards that I'm on each have close to 50% of women on them, so it's no longer an anomaly. Is there work to do? Of course. There's work to do on dual career. There's work to do on childcare. There's work to do on flexibility, although I will say it's perhaps the silver lining of the pandemic is we've gotten out of the FaceTime is what matters. What matters is the output, and I think that's been an enormous benefit for women just to manage the rest of our lives. But I come back to, I think we're really in a new era. I mean, as an example, when Marcia McNutt became the first female head of the National Academy of Science, right, to me, that was shattering an enormous glass ceiling of what it means to really be in the scientific elite of the United States. So I have a ton of optimism, and I would encourage all the women on this call, reach out to other women for mentorship, because senior women love to help younger women succeed. But I would not define yourself in this narrow box of I'm a woman and therefore it's going to be hard. I think that's a mindset that is just no longer relevant.
That's a great point, and a nice segue to the topic of mentorship. I wonder, Leigh, maybe you can start. I wonder what you think of the role of mentorship and what role that's played in your career decisions. Can you point to a person or people that early in your career who gave you advice or encouragement to look for careers beyond the bench? And maybe we'll have everyone answer this question, but we'll start with Leigh.
Yeah, it's funny you should pick me because my answer is actually no. I had, as I mentioned, everyone around me was in academia. I had no idea what you needed to get into industry. I just knew that it was difficult. I didn't have friends in industry. I didn't have contacts, no one in my family. So I really didn't have any mentorship, which is really unfortunate because I see all of these amazing things like the WEF that exist now that are really ways to connect trainees with people who can be their mentors. And those things just weren't around. When I was in grad school, you were either going to be in pharma, a patent attorney, consulting, or a PI. Those were like the things. I was like, I don't really want to do any of those, but I like science. So I just sort of stayed the course and hoped, and I landed on my feet, but there were some tricks along the way. Now I've sort of become a little smarter about trying to find mentors and trying to get mentorship. I will say there's a number of associations you can join, like the Association of Women in Science, Women in Bio, things like this. They often have, networking opportunities. They have mentorship panels where you can be matched with people. They also have lots of seminars and things which are available now, of course, during the pandemic in our virtual world. There's opportunities when you're later in your career. I recently applied to a Women in Leadership fellowship through the 92nd 52nd Street YMCA and was accepted as a fellow for 2022. And the whole purpose of it is to connect women who are sort of in their mid-careers, or for me, early, to help them with professional development and support. And it's not restricted to science, it's women across all sectors. And I think that's really important to bring that diversity into your experience to help you sort of see things from different perspectives. I have a lot of friends who have gone into different areas of non-bench science who all have PhDs. And I'll say my mentors are really my peers. I have a few very close friends who are at different pharma or biotech companies, and they're the people who I sort of look to for mentorship, even though we're peers. We share experiences in both motherhood and science and our non-academic careers, and I find that to be a real source of support for me. Thank you.
Thanks. And Jeannie, any recollections of mentors that had an impact on you?
Yes, so my two PIs from graduate school, Lonnie Levin and Jochen Buck, were really instrumental in helping me take a step into a new career. So they made the introduction to the person in the tech transfer office who allowed me to follow him around and ask him questions and bother him. They were very open to the concept of leaving academia and trying something new. And I think that's also very much because in pharmacology, I think it was not uncommon to have researchers step out of academia and into the area with pharmacology in the context of pharma or biotech fairly frequently. And so it was something that, at least within my department, was not uncommon and not unusual, and not, I would say, the considered a second tier option to move away. They were really wonderful and incredibly supportive. And now I get to see them, crossing on the street, and they say, "We got you started in this career," and are very proud of that. And I'm very proud of it, and always thankful to them. Also, when I had my first job, and I was looking to make a step that was not lateral but up, and frankly, I think something that at the time I would have said I'm completely unqualified for. I probably shouldn't even apply for this job. And the person who was heading the technology transfer office at Mount Sinai at the time said, "I don't really care that you're not qualified and that you don't hit all of the job requirements." So if you looked at the list of things, I got filtered out by the HR machine because I didn't tick all of the boxes. And her thing was, "I don't really care because I think you have potential." And so somebody took really a chance on me and was a champion for me taking a position. And then it set me up really in a place where I didn't want to disappoint somebody. If I failed at my job, then she would have failed at her job, which was to identify talent. And so I think those are two areas where really one was getting an entry into my career, and then the first really big step up. I think there were people who took a chance on me, and those are things that I will be forever grateful for. But it also now inspires me to look around and say, I want to take a chance on somebody who maybe they don't quite fit the profile of what I would need, but I think they're a superstar. And I don't think I'm going to get it wrong. And so it's really, I think, mentorship. It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to necessarily even be articulated. I think it's just something that you will find somebody who sees it in you, and I think latch on to that. And I think those can be, as Leigh mentioned, through opportunities that are created for you that you can participate in, where there are mentors set up for you. And then I think there are just opportunities where there will be people who you encounter throughout your days that really see in you what you may not be able to see in yourself.
Wonderful, thank you. So as scientists, we're often not provided with a lot of practical business training. Jeannie, you talked about going from pharmacology to pharma as a sort of natural fit. We're so focused on our research, perhaps, that we don't develop other skills that should get us ahead, or if we want to branch out into science. Jessica, you got your PhD at Rockefeller and then went back to school to get an MBA at Harvard. What prompted your decision, or perhaps who prompted that decision? And what do you recommend for scientists as they think about going to business school, or if they have an interest in the business side of research?
Yeah, I can't say that this was particularly well thought out. Remember, this was now 25 plus years ago. I was terrified to tell anybody that I was going to leave academic science. I was afraid that I would be viewed as a failure and that I would not have support. I think it's very different now. And in hindsight, that was not an appropriate mindset, but that's where I was. I knew I needed to do something else to get training. And frankly, I knew how to apply to graduate school, right? We all know how to do well on standardized tests. And Harvard had a program that would give me a full scholarship. I thought, gosh, this is easy. So late at night on a manual typewriter, I typed out the application. I didn't know, by the way, it was hard to get into, right? I bought a suit. I took the train up. I was interviewed. I did this all basically secretly, and only at the very last minute told Green Guard that I needed a letter of recommendation because I didn't know what was going to happen. So do not do this, right? I implore all of you on the webinar, think about this, communicate it. Is business school important? Sort of. And it gets back to something that Jeannie described earlier, and Karen, you have as well, right? Being a scientist is really it's not about being in the lab, doing experiments, writing papers, going to conferences. It's about asking questions. It's about having a rational view about how the world works. It's having a desire to create positive change in the world. It's asking good questions, et cetera. All of those are intrinsics that will hold all of you in great stead as you go into business. But there are additional things that you're going to need: a vocabulary, a network, in some cases, some very practical analytic tools like how to read a financial statement that I'm sure Karen is world-class in. And so in some way, you're going to have to get those skills. You can get them through internship. You can get it through your first job. You can get it through business school. There are a lot of different ways to do it. And that path is going to be very dependent on what's your first job, how much time do you have. At the time, I was not married. I didn't have children, so I had a lot of flexibility. Many of you may not. So there are multiple ways to do it. But I think it's important to recognize that as you move into more translational work, over time, you'll be there not because of your specific expertise in an area, as Leigh was talking about in her first job, but because of your ability to critically think and assimilate a lot of information. And so that's a skill set that you're going to want to amplify in some way.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's transition now to this topic of translational development. Jeannie, we've received a lot of questions about text transfer. Could you tell us a bit more about your role specifically? When is the right time for a scientist to come to talk to you about their discovery?
Sure, thank you. So technology transfer here at Rockefeller is really around managing technologies, commercializing technologies. There are two different components to our business. I would say there's an enterprise component, and this is patenting, so seeking intellectual property protection on assets when appropriate. It's marketing, so finding potential partners to advance that asset. It's negotiation, so licensing a particular asset to a company. And then there's post-deal compliance, so holding their feet to the fire to ensure that they are a good steward of our asset. So that's the enterprise component. There's also a service component to our business. So enabling agreements that help researchers move forward in their science, whether it's a confidentiality agreement, so to protect non-public information being exchanged in one or both directions, and also material transfer agreements with academia and with companies that further research. So we do have two different components of our business. I think when we're talking about when does a researcher come to us and talk about their discovery, I would say it's way before it's a discovery. It is never, it can be too late to come to talk to our office, but it can never be too early. And too late is because in everywhere in the world except for the US, with a little bit of leeway, once an invention is publicly disclosed, you have forfeited the right to seek patent protection around it. You have donated it to the world. So if in fact you have a discovery that you think may have some commercial relevance, we would like to know about it far before something is embargoed or in press or in final revisions. We don't like to just get the galley proofs. We would like to be involved really along the way. And so there are many reasons for that. It's not just to enable us sufficient time to look at a disclosure that has come into our office and evaluate it and position it from, let's say, a patent position or from a commercial position or a product position, right? What would it be in the greatest glory of what you have done? What would be the product on the market? Who would pay for it? Who would buy it? Who would sell it? So these are all questions that we ask. But we really would love to know from the early inception, even if something is not immediately actionable by our office, we would like to be notified about it, be following along with it, and for many different reasons. So for example, targets in and of themselves are not patent eligible subject matter. You can't protect a patent. But if we know about a target that somebody is working on, it's really exciting, they've got a nice assay that is working in the laboratory, we as an office can actually let TDI know about this. And this is actually where TDI comes in and says, great, you've got a target, you've got a way to probe the biology, you have some neat understanding about the mechanism and can take you the next step. We will follow along, and then it will come full circle where our office is in a position to be actionable, to take some kind of action on that. So I would say when to come talk to us, just whenever. That's entirely why we exist here. I think probably one of the greatest things about this job, about this career, is that my colleagues, myself, we're often the first people who get to hear about somebody's science before the rest of the world. So that special baby that somebody loves, so dearly, and nobody else knows about it because the Nature paper isn't out yet, the JAMA paper isn't out yet. We know about it. We're following along with it. We're creating the strategy about positioning it. And I will say sometimes the best way to get a technology out to the public is sometimes just donating it to the public. Have a great publication, people will start doing it. But often it requires a patent protection around this or some type of intellectual property protection that will incentivize a company to take the next steps, and that's when we choose to file. So bottom line, we are on the 3rd floor of Founders. We just moved in, so we don't have a sign, but if there is anyone on this Zoom that feels like they had a discovery, come knocking. If there's anyone on this Zoom who thinks that they've got a target, they've got a neat program, and they think in the end there is something that could reach the market in some capacity, come talk to us. And I'll probably regret actually making that open invitation, but this is, look, when we talk about who our key stakeholders are, right? There are only so many clients that we have. There are only so many laboratories that we have here. For us to be well informed, for us to be involved, for us to be keyed on the research so we can work collaboratively together to position an asset if that's appropriate. This is what we're here for. This is the sole singular mission of my office.
Fantastic. So maybe we can drill in a little bit more around this question of the right time to bring your research.
Yeah.
With respect to the TRYDI, which is obviously a unique resource for graduate students actually at Rockefeller, what stage of the discovery process should people be reaching out? Maybe Leigh, you can give us some context around the TRYDI and how that's a resource for entrepreneurial scientists and perhaps graduate level scientists in terms of their interactions with TRYDI.
Yeah, we are a resource for anyone in the tri-institutional community. So we are a group of drug discovery professionals who have both industrial and academic backgrounds. There's a cumulative, I think, 100 or 150 years worth of experience in pharma amongst our vice presidents and our CEO. There are currently 10 drugs on the market, although I think it may be 9 now, that were produced in part by different people on our senior management committee. So we have a lot of experience. There's also members like me who came from academia, and we understand the pressures and the structure of an academic lab and how that works. And so I like to think of myself a little bit as like a translator. We are supported by the institutions as well as Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and we are essentially a drug discovery enterprise at the interface of academia and industry. We don't take any IP. So I know Jeannie talked about IP. Anyone that comes to work with us, everything's covered by confidentiality. We won't share anything. We also often get to see some of the really exciting data before it gets published. In fact, that's the best thing for us to see, because then it still has its sort of competitive advantage. We also don't take any IP. It stays with the university. So there's no, you're not, it doesn't cost you anything in terms of IP or financially to come and work with us. It's a collaboration. There is an application process, and we have a scientific advisory board that reviews applications. But that being said, even if you aren't in a position to apply, you don't have all the nuts and bolts needed for an official application, we do a lot of outreach and a lot of free consulting. I'd say I meet with probably 20 to 30 different PIs per year just to give input on how to design an assay to target to get a small molecule inhibitor of your enzyme, or how to design an animal study so that you can get drug exposure levels, so that you can correlate your effect with how much drug is in the animal's bloodstream. We do a lot of that type of work. So really, anytime is good to talk to us. It's never too early. In fact, I would say the earlier, the better. If you did a genetic screen and you want to pick which genes you should follow up on to try to pursue a therapeutic angle, talk to us. We can help you say, like, which of these might be druggable. We have computational chemists who can do virtual screening. We have medicinal chemists who know how to actually make drugs. And we have biologists like myself who understand how to take something that's sort of an assay that you've run a couple times and turn that into something that can be used to find a new compound. So we're here to talk to you anytime. My email is lbaxt@trytdi.org. Feel free to email me or go on our website. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. That's a really exciting opportunity for those listening and a great resource. Before we switch to audience Q&A, Jessica, you've been involved and are on the board of companies who have really traversed this translational space and have now got very successful products. What are some of the mistakes that you're aware of that are commonly made by researchers in the early stages of therapeutics development that you think can be avoided?
I think one of the biggest mistakes, particularly in the smaller companies, is the failure or the tendency to forget that most of these products are not going to make it to market, right? That doesn't mean, by the way, they're not incredibly innovative and the science paper isn't wonderful, but there's so many other things other than the fundamental theory of the underlying biology. As Jeannie's talking about, you actually have to have a patent. You have to be able to manufacture it. You have to be able to manufacture it at a cost that makes it sensible for the marketplace. You have to get there before competitors do, et cetera. And so it takes a certain amount of resilience to understand that you're going to be taking forward a portfolio of things, and depending on the product and the therapeutic area, 1 in 50 may make it, 1 in 10 may make it, and you have to be prepared for that, right? There are highs and lows. And I think you have to have that mindset going in that each one of these things teaches you something about how to develop a drug, about how to build an organization, about how to work and design particularly clever trials in that new disease state. But you do have to be prepared for that. And, as Leigh was describing in her early career trajectory, companies rise and fall all the time. And you have to have some patience for that, I would say.
Very good advice. So at this point, I'd like to take some questions from our audience. As a reminder to the audience, you can submit through the Q&A, a function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our first question is from Andrea Morris. How would you recommend that early career scientists get business experience while also engaging in bench research? Can they do both? Who wants to take that one?
So I would imagine it's possible, and I think certainly with the resources available it is. I didn't do that, and I wish I did. I can share that there are classes, there are Actually, I think maybe one of the things that I can commit to doing is working on a list of resources that can be shared with the attendees for different opportunities, because we're making reference to training sessions, mentorship programs, and so I think giving more specificity around that would be beneficial. So I think it's possible to do both. I think there is also a reality, though, that getting a doctoral degree is a very serious, time-consuming effort, and it is, I would argue, your primary focus during that time. I think it's very hard to focus on too much more than that, and I think the entire purpose of getting a doctoral degree is to be trained in science. So I think everything else that around that is a bit peripheral. And the focus should be, is there a program where I can get a PhD and then move on to, am I going to law school? Am I getting an MBA? I think it's very challenging, although possible, to do both. But I think ultimately you are a trainee in a doctoral level program, and I think at least for some people on the Zoom, at a premier institution. And so I think splitting focus too much, and there may be a difference of an opinion on this one, but I wouldn't want to encourage anyone to split their focus too much away from what I think the primary goal is.
I could just add to what Jeannie said. I actually had a friend who wanted to do this in the lab I was in previously, and Harvard offers a mini MBA program where I don't know if it was 3 or 6 months. It's fairly intensive. You have to be ready to be working, like she was a postdoc. So you're in lab all day and you're doing that work all night. And she had to get sign off on it, obviously, from her postdoctoral advisor. But she ended up going into venture, and she does like technology evaluation for a venture capital group in Boston now. And that business experience I know was really invaluable. So it's worth seeing if any of the institutions in the New York area might offer something like that.
If I could chime in, I think, Jeannie, your offer of the resources would be really helpful for people. I'd also say, certainly you can't split your time. Getting a PhD at a top tier institution is all that you do. However, I think there's a tendency for all of us just to have our lives be entirely focused on the lab. And certainly when I was at Rockefeller, my friends and I, there'd be weeks we wouldn't leave campus. I wish in hindsight I had done more to take advantage of the fact that New York has lots of other things going on. And I had friends that were working on Wall Street and in law firms. And I saw very little of them because I was so focused on the lab. So in terms of that, just a little bit of opening the aperture a bit, right? I did read the New York Times cover to cover every day, and that helped a bit. But I would just encourage, if you think you have an inkling to do something broader, you do have to start thinking more broadly, even if you're not going to suddenly part-time take another job, et cetera.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think in terms of, going into a program versus a mini experience, talking to people, perhaps in your field of specific research, about how they're thinking about this commercially, those sorts of interactions can be very useful in a mini sense, learning about the business application. Okay,
so Karen, if I could just add one more thing, because it might be relevant for people on the call. I did tell at the time the academic dean that I wanted to do this, and she very kindly set me up for a day where I actually shadowed a leading healthcare venture capitalist just for the day.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I decided I didn't want to do that. That was useful. But also at the end of the day, he said, I think you can do this. And it was very powerful to have someone outside suggest that I had some talent that was not just about pipetting, right? So these very short experiences can be quite valuable.
Yes, totally agree. Maggie Rosa has a question. As a first-year PhD student, I'm still picking my rotations and my thesis lab. What scientific skills, knowledge do you think I should learn during my PhD to be able to eventually join industry? Also, do you have any advice about picking your thesis supervisor? We may have touched on many of the topics about transitioning and during the PhD, eventually joining industry. Anything to add or on this topic of a supervisor?
I would add, pick the science that you're excited about and the supervisor that you love, right? Your exact PhD is not relevant over time. It's not relevant for Jeannie, Leigh, myself, Karen, I suspect for you either, right? It's how you think. You want your PhD experience to be a terrific one. You learn a lot, you have a good time, you publish, you develop some great mentors. I wouldn't try and pick the lab that you think industry is going to find useful. They actually don't care. What they care about is you have a PhD from a preeminent institution. That's all they're looking at.
I totally agree. I also want to mention that I think your postdoc lab is a little bit more important in terms of your interest in going to industry. Looking for labs that have a history of sending people to industry or have connections with industry can be really beneficial. I know the lab I came from at the Broad collaborated with a few different companies, and that was really helpful to be involved in those because you learn some additional skills there. There are also industry postdocs. So many companies have industry postdocs. They're usually 2 years. And that's another great way to kind of get your feet wet if it's something you might be interested in. And it's 2 years. So if you do it and you decide it's not for you, you can still go back and do an academic postdoc if you want to.
Great. All right, there's one more question. What advice might you have for a bachelor level scientist who has bench experience in both industry and academia, who is interested in non-bench or non-traditional scientific roles? Do you see this space for non-PhDs in these alternative career paths? How instrumental would you say a PhD is in alternative or business-focused science career paths?
I think I'll start with that. Is certainly so within our office we have various areas of expertise that range from patent to being able to evaluate technologies to more administrative roles, specifically when it comes to the business development and licensing professionals. So these are everything from technology, scouting, evaluating, all the way to deal making. We're a relatively small office, and we do have, of the, myself included, of the 4 individuals who are in this role, one does not have a doctoral degree. And I can share with you that while it is important to have knowledge in science, it is not a deal breaker to not hold a doctoral degree or an MD. If you happen to be, for example, in computer science, where now it's all about AI and algorithms, is that that's actually often a place where there's plenty of room to grow in tech transfer, simply having the experience. So it really ranges. I think there is a kind of a basic knee-jerk baseline of you should have a PhD, because then you have a proven way that we know that you know how to think. But to make that a job requirement is ill-advised, because one would miss out on very talented people.
I completely agree with Jeannie. I actually know a number of people who are actually vice presidents and other high levels in biotech and pharma who don't have PhDs. I think, it can take some extra years of bench science before you get to sort of switch to that track of going the way that someone who comes in with a postdoc would go. But that's not really any different than spending that time doing your PhD and postdoc. And I definitely see no difference in those people in terms of their scientific acuity or anything. So I don't think it matters, really.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on something Jessica and Jeannie said earlier. I mean, critical thinking skills, knowing how to ask great questions, building a case study, and lining up evidence. These are all skills that are required in industry or in the business side of industry. And so practicing those skills, obviously that you get to learn that during a PhD, but practicing those skills without a PhD, I think is completely possible. And as Leigh said, I know some incredibly successful people in the industry who do not have PhDs, but have all of those skills that we just touched on. And that's really taken them very far in their careers. So are there any other questions? We're coming up close on time now, but there is an opportunity for final questions if there's anything we haven't covered. Okay, seeing none. Looks like we are finished. Any final remarks from our panelists before I conclude the session?
I mean, I'll just say that I think I think Jeannie and Jessica would agree with me. Like, we're all here to support other women who are interested in having careers beyond the bench. I personally would be happy to get coffee or email or chat with someone on Zoom if you have an interest in this and you want advice or just to hear about experience, what our jobs are like from day to day. I think it's an intimidating and challenging step to make. And I think talking to people who've actually done it, even if they've had stumbling steps, can be really helpful and reassuring.
I would echo that. And I would just encourage everyone on this call to listen to your gut. Academic science and lab work is very hard, right? And there are good days and bad days. But on average, you should get out of bed pretty excited about what you're doing. And if you're not, listen to that voice. Right. I think it's very important that we live lives that are purposeful and enjoyable and, fully use our capabilities. And so if you think it's you're not going to proceed to run a lab over time, take a deep breath and take the plunge. You have a lot of people here to help you, all of us on this Zoom, lots of resources at Rockefeller. There's extraordinary things you can do. And so I would just encourage you to be bold.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank you, Leigh, Jeannie, and Jessica, for sharing your insights with us. This has been a very engaging conversation, and I hope there were lots of good takeaways for our audience. I'd also like to send our gratitude to the supporters of the Women in Science Entrepreneurship Fund, whose names you will see on our closing slide. And lastly, thank you to our audience for your thoughtful questions. Be safe and have a wonderful evening.